this video, I'm going to go over the main types of positions that exist that involve opposition. It is very important to know these positions very well, especially that these type of endgames usually end up when you are in time trouble. And if you don't know them ahead of time, you might end up blundering a game. So here's our first position. White is actually winning. A typical play that I see a lot is the king wanting to access the key squares. We know the key squares are the second rank above, since our pawn is still in our side of the board. So the king could go to f2, black replies king g7, king e3, king f6, and now white is trying to go ahead of the pawn, let's say king e4, and here black is able to take the opposition and get a draw. We've already seen this, pawn push and black blocks the pawn and the position is drawn here. It's not any better here moving the king to f4 instead, taking the opposition, just because black will be able to stop white from reaching the key squares. The first key square, or the closest to him, is e6, so he's going to be able to come there. Even though we take the opposition, black will respond with king to d6, taking control of the squares c5, d5, and e5, and not allowing white to access the key squares. Therefore, again, this position is drawn as well. However, if we start from the beginning, the way you win this game, and as a rule, you always want to try to go to access the key square that is the furthest away from your opponent's king. So we know that the key squares here are c6, d6, and e6. Well, the closest square to your opponent is the square e6. The one that's furthest away is the square c6. So we will try to reach c6 instead. So what we want to do is move our king to e2 and run towards the square c6. Let's say king responds king g7, king d3, king f6, king c4. And you could see here king e6, even though he has diagonal opposition here, we are able to move our king to c5, taking control of the squares c6 and d6, so black cannot access those, and we are able to take control of those squares. So right here, black can respond with either king to e7, like pushing up, where we're just going to take control of the key square, and now our game is won. Or black can go to the square d7, where now we will be able to take the opposition, and after he moves either left or right, we will be able to gain access to the key square on the second rank, advancing on the other side. And from here, the game is won. The next two positions we're going to look at will involve a knight pawn. Now, if we look at this position, we could see that white is winning. The pawn is in the opponent's side of the board, and the king is on one of the key squares, which is one rank above. We've talked about last time that if the pawn is on your opponent's side of the board already, the key squares become just one rank in front of the pawn. So this position is won. However, just because this position is a win doesn't mean it's going to end up as a win. Actually, I've seen this position many times, and where the students that were playing ended up in a draw. Especially when you are low on time, if you don't know this position ahead of time, there are very many stalemates that can happen. So let me go over a couple moves that can happen. So for example here, if white plays the move king to c6, well, black here can respond with king to a7. And now white has to be super careful. If white pushes the pawn, let's say to b6 check, now black can move the king to a8. Now from here, if white pushes the pawn with check, black will be able to block the pawn, and now a stalemate cannot be avoided, because the only way to protect your pawn is king to b6, which is stalemate. And if white tries to maybe move the king to c7 to be able to push the pawn, well, this is also stalemate. So you could see those type of moves are very typical. Now, the correct move here is to move our king to the rook file. So to win this game, we want to play the king to a6. Now, what happens, black has two responses, either to take the opposition or to move to c7. Let's take a look at both. So first of all, let's say he takes the opposition, king to a8. Well, after this, what we can do is pretty much push the pawn. He's going to be forced to move to b8, and after we push the pawn again, he's not able to go to a8 or c8, so he's going to have to come out where we go to a7, and then we're going to queen our pawn. Now, let's say that black is going to c8 instead. Well, if he does go to c8, all we have to do now is go to a7, and we've talked about if we take control of the last three squares, the pawn can freely move on those, and there's nothing that he can do to stop us getting a queen. And then the last thing that we want to look at is the king moving to c7. If he moves to the c7, same story. We just push the king up, and then promote the pawn to a queen and win the game. Coming back from the beginning, if it's black to move in this position and white has the opposition, after king to a8, if white goes to a6 taking the opposition, this is not a win anymore if black moves the king to b8 and white pushes the pawn to b6. After this, black will move the king to a8, and now if white pushes the pawn to b7 and the black king moves to b8, the only thing that white has to protect the pawn is king to b6, which is stalemate. So coming back, if white has the opposition after king to a8, the correct play here is king to c7. After this, the only move that black has is king to a7, from which white can move the pawn to b6 with check. After king to a8, b7 check again, king to a7, and now white promotes the pawn and is able to win on the next move. And as a quick recap, if black has the opposition and it's white to move, then white wants to go to the rook file to be able to win this position. After king to a8, b6, king to b8, and b7, the black king is forced out, and white can move the king to a7 and then promote his pawn. And if white has the opposition and it's black to move, after the black king moves to a8, white wants to move the king to c7, and after black moves the king to a7, then b6 check, king to a8, b7 check, king to a7, and then white promotes the pawn and wins the game. The next position also involves a knight pawn, but this time we will be defending. I also want you to notice that we are on the rook file again. And here, both moves that black will do here are going to end up in stalemate. If he pushes the pawn to g3 check, we are going to be able to move to h1, and now either move that black is going to do, it's going to end up in stalemate. If he pushes the pawn to g2, we're just going to block the pawn, and he's going to have to move to g3 to protect the pawn, which is stalemate. And if he moves the king to f2, well, this is also stalemate. We have no legal moves. And if we go back to the beginning, if instead of pushing the pawn with check, let's say he does move the king to f2, well, after we push the king to h1, right now if he pushes the pawn, again, this is stalemate. I do want to mention that if he does move the king to g3, he is able to win this game. For example, taking the opposition, we know he is controlling the key square in front of the pawn, and now he has to go to the rook file to win this game. And taking the opposition will not help, as he pushes the pawn. After we block the pawn and pawn push to g2, we do not have access to square h1 anymore. We have to get out, and he's going to be able to move to h2 and then queen the pawn. The next two positions involves a pawn on the 6th rank, and we know if our king controls any of the key squares, which is one rank above, for example like c7, d7, or e7, know that those positions are won. However, even if you don't have access or you cannot control those key squares, you are still able to win with the pawn on the 6th rank if you are able to take the opposition. So right here, king to e6 is actually winning. If black would have moved to e8, if it was black's move and he took the opposition, this position is drawn. However, because it was white to play and we took the opposition, this position will be won. All black has is king to d8, and after we push the pawn to e7, we are going to be able to win the game pretty easily. Here's another position that involves the same idea. Here, if you try to reach the key square right away with the, let's say, king to e5, you're actually just going to end up with a draw, because black can block you from reaching those key squares with e7, and then after the pawn push d6, this position will end up in a draw. So what you want to do instead is push the pawn to d6, to the 6th rank. Now what this does, it blocks the square e7. It takes that square away from black. So all black has in order to stop the pawn from queening is king to e8. And after he moves the king to e8, we can see the pawn is on the 6th rank, and we are able to take the opposition from him. So moving the king to e6 will be winning. After he blocks the pawn, we push, and then we'll be able to win. The next two positions we're going to look at, it's going to involve positions where both players have a pawn. Here, the mistake that happens a lot, and I've seen it a lot in my students' games, is that white right here, the best he's got is a draw, but he's trying to get a win. If you just look at this position, black can attack white's pawn in one move. For white to attack black's pawn, it's going to take him 1, 2, 3 moves, and that's also stepping on a landmine, a lesson that we're going to learn a little bit later. So there's no way that white will be able to win this game. So it's very important to understand that sometimes the positions are a draw, and you want to make sure that you play for a draw. Don't try to play for a win, because you might end up losing this game. So what happens a lot is king to d4. And right here, white will actually lose this game. You know, black can take the opposition. White will have to move away. He cannot step on the square d5 because the black's pawn controls that square. And also, he cannot move to protect the pawn since black controls those squares. So he has to move away. He loses the pawn, and this game is actually lost. So, understanding that this game is drawn, what you want to do is pretty much let black take the pawn, but when he does take the pawn, you will take the opposition from him, and he's not going to be able to access the key squares. So for example, playing something like d3, black attacks the pawn, and you could simply say, okay, go ahead and take it. Black takes the pawn, and you take the opposition. Taking the opposition, and you will not allow black to take control of any of the key squares, which are d4, e4, and f4. You could see his pawn is in his side of the board, and he has to control those squares in order to be able to win. However, he's not going to be able to do that. King d5, we're just going to block him off, not allow him to have access. And this game will simply end up in a draw, as we've seen already. Here's another position where both players have a pawn. And this is one scenario where taking the opposition right away, it's not the correct move. If you look at this position, black already controls the key square g4, which is on the 2nd rank above the pawn. So he's already winning, and not only that, but he's also able to capture the pawn also on a key square. So therefore, right here, taking the opposition right away, it's not going to work. We could actually play it out, and this is what's going to happen. And from here, the game is lost since black controls the key squared e4. Now, this position is actually drawn. What we want to do here is push the pawn to e5. Now, he is not going to be able to push the pawn forward. If you look at this position, white will queen in 1, 2, 3 moves, and for black, it's going to take him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves. And if he does push the pawn, he's actually going to end up losing this game. So he is forced to take this pawn. What happens now, after he takes the pawn, if you look at this position, his pawn is still on his side of the board. Therefore, the key squares is the 2nd rank above, so black will need to access one of these squares, f3, e3, or d3. Well, f3 being the closest. He is not going to be able to reach that, because now we will be able to take the opposition and not allow him to access any of those squares. And if he's trying to go around, we're just going to keep blocking him and not allow him to be able to take any of those squares. Therefore, this position is drawn as well. The last position I want to go over also involves other pieces as well. And I want to mention that it's very important to know the pawn endgames, because a lot of times if you see that the pawn endgame is a win, you might be able to force a trade and then win the game a lot easier that way. You always want to simplify into a winning endgame that you know well, instead of just keeping the pieces on and going through more complications. Sometimes you might end up in winning endgame if your opponent is not careful, like in the position that we see right here. If we look at this position is actually a dead draw. It's a Philidor position, which we are going to learn later on. However, white here made a very interesting move, and he checked the king with the rook to d4, where black made a blunder and he blocked the check with his rook to d5, thinking that just white will just take the rook, he's going to capture the rook, and then this is a drawn endgame. However, white, knowing the pawn endgame, he was able to move and win here. If you want to pause the clock and think about it, you could try to do that. I'm going to continue, and what white actually did is move the king to c4. Now black will lose this game. His rook is pinned to the king, he cannot move the rook away, and the only thing that he's got is either move the king over, in which white will win the rook and then win the game, or take the rook, and now white will take the rook, also gaining the opposition. And after the opposition, if black moves over, he takes control of the key square e5 and win this game. Alright, thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for the next lesson.